So funny story, I think I told you I went to Seattle Pacific University, and while I was there, I lived in this huge residence hall that had 12 floors, and I was on the third floor, and above me was a boys' floor. So the fourth floor was a boys' floor, and one of the boys that lived in the room directly above me, his name was Brett Mortensen. His mom, stepmom actually, Sherry Mortensen, was Bethel's campus pastor. And so I didn't, of course, make that connection at the time. I knew Brett was from Minnesota, but that's pretty common at Seattle Pacific that people are from other places. And Minnesota was actually, there was several students from Minnesota. So fast forward, I graduated from college and I had done an internship with a nonprofit organization that was based in Oregon. And they asked if I would move with them to the Twin Cities. So I did that. And in that time that I was here, for that year, I reconnected with Brett because he was from Minnesota and was hey, we should hang out sometime. And I didn't know it at the time, but he and a good friend who graduated from Bethel, we hung out in this area. And I was like, oh, there's Bethel. And so I had briefly heard of it. But when I was nearing kind of the end of my tenure with this organization, because I had decided I was going to stay out here because my husband's from here. I met my husband in that year too, not Brett. Sorry, this story is getting a little confusing. So anyway, Brett, I had heard of Bethel initially through Brett, and then this organization that I was working for, somebody knew somebody who worked at Bethel, and they were like, you would be a great fit at Bethel. And they introduced me to sort of the right people, which at the time was somebody in seminary admissions, who then made a recommendation that I get an interview with undergraduate admissions, and I ended up interviewing and getting a job here. So long story, but I really feel like my Bethel story began with how Bethel stories begin, with connections and kind of the small community that this is. And I'm so grateful for the Lord's leading me to Bethel, and have had the opportunity to get to know this place and to be known at this place. And it's been such a great fit for me. I've roughly changed jobs every 3 years. I don't think I'm going to do that in this role, but I started in admissions as the admissions event and volunteer manager. And I was in that role for 3 years. Then I became a resident director. And then what did I do after that? Then I worked in career development and calling and the counseling center. And then they asked if I would come back to student life as an interim associate dean for campus engagement. So I did that, and then they asked if I would apply for that job, so I did. Then I was in that role for 3 years. Then I became the Dean of Student Programs under our previous vice president. And then when he left, I became the Associate Vice President for Student Life. And then I was in this role almost 2 years ago. So it's funny, right? Because I often think of my Bethel, now knowing what I know about Bethel now, I often think how unusual it felt for the director of admissions at the time to hire somebody who wasn't a Bethel native. And so I realized at the time I was going up against this job for somebody who I now have been introduced to and know. And this person was a Bethel grad, had been here for a while. And so at the time, I don't think I realized this, but it was unusual for them to hire me because I hadn't had a Bethel undergraduate experience. But I find Bethel to be a really familial place in the sense that people are really known here, and there's an emphasis on Bethel connections, and especially people, I noticed that to be unique. I have good friends from Seattle Pacific, and they're connected, and I'm still connected to them, but not in the way that our Bethel graduates are. And so I think that one of Bethel's strengths and potentially weakness is just this kind of legacy of relationships that have been built by people who went here, then they send their kids here, or people who come here and meet their best friends, and then they stay connected in some way, shape, or form in really significant ways, kind of throughout their life's history. Is this the question where you're asking me what's different about Bethel? Or what it was? When I first came to Bethel, the space was entirely different. So we had 2,800 students, and I remember on any given day walking out into the hallway. So where the RC gym is, where the business center is now, that's where admissions and financial aid was. And then human resources was on the very end there as you head out the RC steps. And then if you went to the right, there was like a vertical or a kind of perpendicular conference room sandwiched in between admissions and then communications and marketing. So you had like this row of offices, like HR, financial aid, admissions, a conference room, and then communications and marketing. And the gym was across from that. And on any given day, I remember walking outside of there, even to use the restroom in RC, and feeling like the hallways were very full of students because we didn't have the brush arbor commons at all. And so where the nursing department is, there's a lounge back there, but it's this area we used to call it the fishbowl. And the dining center was in that nursing department area. And then Market Square was kind of what we would now call the grill, or an eating area, kind of a grab and go area. And it was sort of sandwiched between, there's a classroom there now, but sort of on the front end of the nursing department, in the upsala room space, and student government was downstairs. So just positionally, from a facility standpoint, everything feels different because it just is. I would also say Bethel felt a lot more full because we had, almost 1,000 more students in what is a lot less square footage. So I remember when this Brush Arbor Commons opened in 2009, I mean, people were like, how are we ever going to fill up this building? It was just felt huge, right? And almost there wasn't a concept of how we would use the building or how it would fill up with people. Additionally, there was a lot more woods behind, like where Arden Village West is, that we're not using right now. There was like this huge tree swing, and there was just a lot of like kind of, that whole part of campus didn't feel as connected to main campus as it does now. So physically, the space was really different. I think the students are different than they were when I first came. People wore in those times, like, it felt a lot more casual. People, I think you see this more, but people were wearing like sweatpants and pajama pants, and you could really make a distinction between students and staff and faculty. It also felt, in that way, just a little bit smaller. Like if you needed to do this, this was the one person you called about that. If you needed to do this, this was what you did. Whereas now, having grown from a college to a university in that time even too is a big change. But Bethel feels bigger and it feels different than it did in those days. Felt maybe more like a college when I first started. And this won't make sense to you. It will to these guys. And since they're reporting, I'll say it even though it's long. But like even our campus store, the lady who ran the campus store, I remember going down there being like, this is like a Christian bookstore. It's not a college store. And they sold like mittens, and it was just kind of a different place in that way. So I thought of the people, or the students are different, the people are the same. Like I think the relational piece of Bethel continues. The facilities are really different. It was interesting because a number of things were happening around that time, right? So that would have been in 2008, if my memory is serving correct. Oh, was it 2004? Okay. So a couple of things happened. I started at Bethel in 2003, 2004. And so I remember when we made that university change, I foolishly thought, we're just basically changing our logo because that was the big deal in admissions. But then in 2008, Jay Barnes who had been the provost, became the president. And I remember feeling at that time, there was an economic downturn. And so between 2008 and 2013, there started to be a lot of conversation around what strategies would Bethel have for the future, whether it was go big online or a renewed mission and vision statement, or some of these tenets of who are we as Bethel and who do we want to be. And so the graduate school really was reorganized to sort of be its own channel in some ways, and then to build programs there. And so I think even the work that they're doing right now around One University is fascinating because it's a similar trajectory, but organized really differently. So I would say, though, this kind of small town college feel in some ways, I still feel that for our students, but in other ways, I think it's really changed a little bit. When I first started at Bethel, we had this program in admissions, and maybe it's just because I was more aware of it, where we would contact alumni all over the country, and we would ask them to go to college fairs for us. And we would send them materials. And so I knew all these kind of alumni, and I would say, like, could you go sit at this college fair for 3 or 4 hours and recruit for us? And we would send youth pastors sweatshirts. And I would say our students were a lot more denominationally connected. And that could potentially be because of Bethel's relationship with Converge, or potentially because people in those times were more aware of church denominations than they are now. But it was interesting because as I was thinking about this interview, I'm like fresh off. I went to the S2 conference, which was Converge's biennial meeting, kind of, last week in Indiana. And I can remember at least 2 different times being at Bethel in the summer when the biennial meeting was held here, and people would have like their china cups, and missionaries would come from like all over the world. And it just felt totally different. Whereas this S2 conference, I was like, this doesn't feel very denominationally connected. So I think that's been an interesting journey too, one that I've had more insight into in this current role that I'm in, but also as I think back, one that feels different to me. So when I first came to Bethel, when I moved from admissions to student life, it was Judy Mosman's last year. And I remember sitting in Judy Mosman's office for my interview and her asking me about women in ministry. And I was like, 24 or something at the time. And so I was like, do I tell Judy what I really think about this? Like, I hadn't done the research on the school's affiliation about women as pastors or other things. I didn't know much about the Baptist General Conference. But over the years, one of the things that I've appreciated about Judy and even other female leaders who have followed at Bethel is that we've actually had quite a few female leaders in higher positions of leadership. And when I go to other conferences or other things where that subject has been brought up, I've never really felt like that was a problem here at Bethel, because we've been fortunate to have so many of those folks. So yeah, I think that the structure there was kind of like Deans for Residence Life, one over Community Life. So they were more structured around programming areas versus men and women. But to be honest with you, I've never really felt like there was the same barriers here for women that maybe existed at some more traditionally complementarian or traditional role type of schools. And I think having been exposed to schools with Association for Christians in Student Development, or even schools near us, Bethel's always felt like a place that our female students could succeed in business classes, in really whatever career field that they wanted to be in. I think the Ring by Spring stigma exists here, and I've seen that change socially a little bit for students, but I feel like in really positive ways. Like, there's still plenty of people who meet their spouses here, but I don't feel like it's the only reason that people come here, or that they feel like that's something they have to do when they're here. Does that make sense? In terms of how we serve male and female students, I don't know that has felt different to me over the years. I think it's been pretty consistent. Well, let me say this. There have been so many women here who have encouraged and paved a way for me in terms of, like, when I was in admissions, I got married, I had babies, people threw me baby showers, they came to my wedding, they encouraged me, and I can remember vividly working in counseling services when I was trying to decide if I was going to keep working or if I was going to stay home with my kids. And I felt this call to continue to work. And the people who had made different choices than me in health and counseling, nurses, other people who were here were like, you are great at this. You should keep doing this if this is where you feel like the Lord is calling you. It's really interesting. Deb Harless is one of the few, and I don't say this like it will sound negative. Up until I met Deb Harless and started meeting with her more regularly, the leaders that I had in my life who were above me in student life were primarily single women. And so I got to a point in my career where I sort of had this innate belief that only single women could be vice presidents or could do these jobs. And so kind of fast forward, I decided I was going to stay in this job. Then I became the dean of student programs, and I had started spending a little bit more time periodically with Deb Harless. She had like 14 direct reports, so I didn't see her very often. But she was such an encouragement to me and would send notes, send flowers sometimes. She would check in with me. And it was clear that she was sort of saying, like, I want to be invested in you. So I would ask her about, hey, what do you think about this career choice versus this? What do you think I should do here? And she was really, really helpful. But during that time, she also sponsored me into a lot of opportunities within the CCCU where I was able to go to different conferences and different learning opportunities. And it was there. And I remember it vividly. I think I was pregnant with my third child unexpectedly. And I went to this thing thinking, I'm going to for sure quit my job. I'm going to stay home. There's no way we can do this, even though he's like 5 years younger than my girls. And I remember going to this women's dinner that was at the CCCU conference, and my vice president was there, and she was great. But literally, I sat by all these other women, and they all had like 3 children. They were all either leading as like deans or vice presidents. And it was like, I felt like the Lord was saying, there's people who do this, and you can do this. And it was such an encouragement to me. So I would say like Marie Wisner, Deb Sullivan Trainer, Deb Harless, Edie Schultze, all people who I keep in touch with who have been significant mentors. Barb Martin have been significant mentors for me here. But I've also had this group of peers outside of here that I was sort of sponsored into that I think really gave me the ability to say yes to like later stages of my career at Bethel. So historically, since this is an interview about historical things at Bethel, I feel like Bethel has been a place that has long, like I think I told you that to begin with, has long supported female leaders. And we've had such great examples of them here. And so like I've always sought to say to my staff, if you want to work full time and you are in a stage of your life where you're having a family, you can do that and we'll make that possible. And I think I try to do that for both my female staff, but also for male staff. And I think one of the values that Bethel as an organization holds is for family and for appropriate work-life balance, though sometimes it doesn't feel that way. I think Bethel holds that value. Does it actually play out that way? I don't know. But I try hard to recognize that the role of student life on any college campus is often heavy because you're carrying the weight of student joys, student sorrows, sometimes student problems. You're helping students, and that doesn't happen neatly between 8 and 4:30. And so I try hard to help people understand if in some ways this feels like a lifestyle, it is, but in that realm, there's always room to make sure that your life fits in there. And there should always be room for that, for vacation, for family time, for making that a priority, especially in seasons that are particularly intense. I think particularly about our women of color who have worked at Bethel, and I think some of those folks would say that it's really hard. It was really hard for them in many ways to be not only a person of color, but also a woman of color at Bethel. I lean more towards the optimistic side. That's clear probably. But so in that way, I feel like sometimes I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how much harder that could be for me. I think I've had moments where I've been like, to my male, I remember one time with male RDs where I was like, I'm not anyone's work wife here. I will not be doing that job for you. So you need to do your part and I'm going to do mine. And I think sometimes I felt like male colleagues' mistakes are overlooked more, whereas just as a female in leadership, I don't know if that's true inside or outside of Bethel too, but as a female in leadership, there's this kind of like, you have to have the right clothes, the right presence, the right public speaking, the right education. I think there are those pressures for women that exist in the workforce, but I don't think they're unique only to Bethel. And I would also say I have led a lot of men and been led by some men, probably actually been led by more women here than men. But my male colleagues, they have sponsored and cheered me on and respected my leadership more so, even just as much, if not more so, than my female colleagues. And so I mentioned a lot of females who have been great here, but I would say I have just as long a list of males who have believed in me, sponsored me into opportunities, affirmed my leadership, and really respectful. And I try hard to show up with my gifts, but also to respect that there's other people who I hire who have greater gifts than I do. And I want them to do those things because that makes us all better. So I try to lead in that way, not to sort of say like, I have to prove that I'm worthy of this position, but it's like, I'm uniquely made. I can do certain things in this role. And then if I don't have those gifts, I'm going to hire people who do, and so that the work gets done in effective ways. I don't know, seeing that like 60% of our population has almost always, in my whole time at Bethel, it's been really 60-40. And when I was at SPU, it was 70-30. And I count like our football team as a driver for more evenness. Maybe that's wrong, but I think that's partly what it is. I think it probably depends who you ask, but I think by and large, like our male faculty, like the ones in this room, are champions for female students. I see that I think it depends on maybe the discipline that you're in, but like I look at like, I don't know if she's still here, but like Karen Rogers in engineering. It's like Bethel chooses to put highly qualified people in places that say to our female students, you can do this. And whether it's a campus pastor role or a provost role. So I would say I haven't really run across that, maybe besides like Title IX, which is not something we should record. I have that in my area, which is sometimes really hard. But I would say, I think by and large, our female students feel that they can succeed here. I think the larger challenge, Chris, is that they're usually coming from a culture that has told them, you're going to be a wife, you're going to be a mother. And then when they encounter their own intellect, their own power, their own talents in a new way at Bethel, they're not always quite sure how to fully step into that. So like, for example, I had this dynamic leader, 2 or 3 years in a row, I had female student body presidents. And I remember one of them who was just probably my strongest female student body president. And one day we'd been working together almost the whole year, and we were driving somewhere, and she said, I've never met somebody who worked as a wife and a mom, like worked outside the home when they were like a wife and a mom. And she was like, and working with you this year has told me that I could do that. And I always tried to affirm, like, maybe you'll work part-time or you'll take some time off, but it doesn't mean that you won't go back. And I was like, wow, how is this student who's so competent, so smart, so capable, feeling like her familial upbringing culture is telling her this is like what you will do? So I think our students maybe more experience that than it being Bethel telling them they can't do it. Does that make sense? And they're trying to wrestle with like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? And how do I tell and I have that all the time, and I just don't let it bother me. If people will be like, your husband does a lot. I'm like, yeah, he does. Everybody in our family does. That's what happens when you have 2 working parents. Let's see. I'm just trying to think. I don't think we've had a director of admissions who's been a woman at Bethel, have we? They've all been males. Yeah, so I guess I would say in admissions, there were people in support roles. And I remember my boss in there, who I still keep in touch with. I had 2 supervisors actually in there. It's a dual report. And he would always be like, when you're running your own shop someday, Miranda, because I know you will be, then you can do it that way. And I was in my early mid-20s. And so I was kind of like, okay. Then my tactic just changed, right? Of like, I'm just going to find a way to help you think this is a good idea and we'll work together on it. So pivotal moments, I guess. I mean, I think Deb Harless becoming the provost was probably a pivotal moment because who was right before her? It was David Clark, wasn't it? Yeah. And then he went to the seminary, and I think you can give this on camera because Deb will probably say it. I think Deb had previously applied for that role, and they'd hired David Clark over her. And then David Clark wasn't in that role very long, and Deb became the provost, and I think became very powerful in her role in terms of what she brought. And I think she had this unique way with faculty where she was about the needs of the university, the needs of the administration, but also fairness to faculty. And I saw her do that in a lot of meetings where she would deliver hard news, but really fairly. She would listen to people, and then she would somehow get people to move forward, even if it was really bad news. So I think that was a pivotal turning point for Bethel and represented a lot of, I think, the best of Bethel in some ways. And Deb Sullivan Traynor was there in her role too, kind of alongside Deb Harless. So that was a pivotal moment. I would say it's interesting. I've been more up close to athletics the last 2 years, and it's hard to name names in these. You're going to edit this, right, Sam? Gretchen Hunt has been at Bethel forever, and she has been like a mainstay making athletics what it is in compliance. She keeps us, I mean, she is just a trusted, wise leader. And I'm not sure if she would have ever gone for the athletic director role, but I think women are sorely underrepresented in athletics. And I think I know our athletic director would say that because we talk about it all the time. But we have some really, like Megan Kirchhoff, Gretchen. We have too few women, Penny Four, who's fantastic. And Ann Hatton was somebody we hired under my tenure, and we actually had some male candidates. And I think at the time we were like, okay, we're not really seeing anyone. We should hire this. And then I was like, absolutely not. We need to wait. And Anne has been fantastic in track. So I think we're trying in those areas, but it's less representative than it should be in terms of female representation. I'm trying to think though, answering your original question. So I think Deb Harless was a pivotal moment. I think we had like Edie Schultze as a female vice president, but we also had Judy Mosman. So I feel like in the area of student life, it's been a long history of like great female leaders, and female leaders I aspire to be like. And so we've been really, really fortunate in that area. I think there's been some key faculty members here, key female faculty members who have made really significant contributions. You guys interviewed Kathy Nevins, who's like a Bethel historian. I remember pretty clearly the death of Stacey Hunter Hecht being a huge deal for our students here. But yeah, overall, I just would say the male faculty and staff here support female leaders. And I think I think our students see that, and they are respected in a lot of great ways. You know, I just think so much of what we view as normal comes from the family systems that we grow up in. And my mom stayed home with us for a while, but she was like a high school principal. And so I never really felt like being in a career would be, like, I never thought, oh, that wouldn't be attainable. And I think it's because I had a family example of it. I do find in the Midwest that, especially in Christian circles, and I think this is changing a little bit, but there still is the traditional value of females staying home, primarily doing things with the kids. And so I find that most of the like pushback or dissonance from that I feel about that, I often will have to like really take a step back and be like, that's actually not about me. It's not about what my family's chosen to do. It's more about like other Christian women who are like, I wouldn't say judgmental about that, but who might hold a different value than I do. And so I try to see it curiously as like, oh, they hold a different value. Their families run differently. And my family has benefits from me working, and then there's trade-offs from that. But I see in the church, even still, I think in the Midwest especially, there's a lot, there still is a lot of traditional held values. I don't see that as much at Bethel, but I do see it outside of here, especially in Minnesota. The group of women VPs at the student life level is small. And so, but I'm often in those settings where I'm leading men or with men or a minority. And so I think I've come to think of that as normal, but they're powerful women. And I think one of the things that will be really interesting. So, okay, honestly, I love him and he's my boss, but like, I don't know that Bethel would have hired a female who didn't have graduate degrees and a ton of experience for a president role. I just don't think that would happen. And when I observe female presidents in the CCCU, many of whom I've had the opportunity to meet, they're usually leading a small school, or they've been brought in to turn around a failing school. And so some of the bigger institutions, I think, haven't had female presidents, but I think there's a couple of searches right now that are really going to be interesting to see what happens, because I think there's some really qualified female candidates, and I'll be curious. Like, for example, Calvin's looking for a president, and the RCA is going through a bunch of change right now, or CRC, both. And I'll be curious, like, will Calvin hire a male president? Would they hire a first female president? And that would be the first within that denomination of schools. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but it's still a pretty small group. So I think that there's more representation of women leaders at Bethel than there is across the CCCU institution. And some institutions maybe like it that way. So even on cabinets, like there's 3 of us on this cabinet. And I think right now with where they are, like Northwestern just has 1 right now. So women are underrepresented, but I've never felt like it's a barrier, but I'm sure some do. I mean, I would just say, like, I feel like this place has been, I used this word at the beginning. Bethel is more friendly to people who are natives of Bethel, but when you stick around this place, so let's use, if we can think of another word for this, this would be great, but I would consider when I first came to Bethel that I was an immigrant to Bethel, and I think there's a number of people who that's been true, although there's a lot of like natives here. And so Bethel sort of accepts natives in a certain way. And yet, having been here a really long time, I feel like I am a native now. And so I think that's the strength of the Bethel culture, that it accepts people as its own. And the longer I've been at this place, the more that I've grown to love and respect it. And I think there's a uniqueness to our educational philosophy that Dr. Geertz would tell you is our pietistic heritage, which leads Bethel to be in this really interesting place, I think theologically, but also how it positions itself, that I'm just so attracted to and want to be protective of, because I think the world is moving towards the polars, right? Where it's like we're ultra conservative or we're more liberal. And yet Bethel has managed to be in this kind of like liminal in between space that I think helps our students learn how to be civil in the world, learn how to lead with integrity, learn how to lead with optimism and humility, and to hold their perspective strongly, but also to welcome the perspective of others. And I hope that that's something we never lose, and something that I want us to protect here. And I hope that our students can catch a vision for that, and that ironic spirit will be something that draws people to this place even more so.